Good evening. I'm Jerry Hebron from Oakland Avenue Urban Farm in Detroit. I'd like to welcome you tonight to our lecture series, Food and Literacy for All. I'm going to start with some announcements. Guess what? 3 classes to go. Yay! Oh, you guys really want to hang out, huh? We have 3 classes to go. It's free and open to the public, and for community folks, we ask you to enroll ahead of time so that we know you'll be here. Tonight, our speaker is Samina Raja, who is also speaking tomorrow in Detroit at Eastern Market in collaboration with C. Wayne. So I hope some of you all will get an opportunity to be there tomorrow if you happen to be in Detroit. Next week, we have Dara Cooper in Detroit after she speaks here on Tuesday. She'll be at the Vanguard CDC in the North End. We have a reminder that for some of you who are looking to earn extra credit, D-Town Farms has volunteer opportunities on Saturdays and Sundays. Saturdays from 8 to noon, Sundays from 9 until noon. You can send an email to Elise to reserve your spot, or you could just show up. In Detroit, the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm has a paid internship for students. I hope some of you are interested in that. Please see me after class if you are, or reach out to Lily or myself via email. Time to check your clickers. Everybody have a clicker? If you don't have one, raise your hand. Please power up, and you can hit BB to sync. Want to thank our sponsors, the School for Environment and Sustainability, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Center for the Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Center for Engaged Academic Learning, CEW and Francis and Sidney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, Wayne State University, the School of Public Health, Urban and Regional Planning Program of Tomba College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And now, everybody get a clicker? We're all straight there? Okay. First question. Well, come on up. Here's Leslie.
This is my question. I'm not ready for it. All right. We'll get to that in just a second. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Samina Raja tonight. Dr. Raja's research focuses on planning, policy, and design for sustainable food systems and healthy communities. She's a professor of urban and regional planning and associate dean of research and inclusive excellence at SUNY Buffalo. She's the founder and the principal investigator of the University of Buffalo Food Systems Planning and Healthy Communities Lab, where she directs Growing Food Connections, which is a national initiative to build the capacity of local governments to strengthen food systems. If you don't know about the website that's connected to Growing Food Connections, please look for it. It's an amazing resource full of planning and policy briefs and reports, videos of webinars on food systems planning. It has a great database for local food systems policies where you can upload policies that you might be involved with locally and learn from others that have been uploading policies from around the country and around the globe. I think there's almost 200 or more policies on there now. So it's a great resource, and there's many other things on that website. Dr. Raja also does work internationally through an initiative she runs called Plan Refuge, which stands for Planning for Regenerative, Equitable Food Systems in Urbanizing Global Environments. This project aims to understand and mitigate food inequities experienced by smallholder farmers in India and other countries in the global south, including trying to tackle challenges that they face like globalization and climate change. So if you've been listening, I'm curious to know now what you think Samina Raja studied as an undergraduate student, since there's many undergraduate students in the room. So, what did she study? Geology with a focus on glaciology, civil engineering, agronomy and food science, urban planning with a focus on housing, or architecture? Ah, I stumped you. So it was about a third of you got it right. It's civil engineering. So if you're studying engineering, you could still come over to the urban planning side, do food systems work. Urban planning with a focus on housing was her master's degree. And she would love, I think, to be a geologist and climb mountains and sit by glaciers all day, but she didn't study that at any point. So one final thing that I want to tell you about is that I think what stands out in all the work that Dr. Raja does is her genuine and relentless commitment towards issues of equity. She focuses on equity in her scholarship. She advances equity through her close work with policy actors and the long-term relationships that she develops with community partners. And she demonstrates equity in the academy. For instance, when she was approached to become the Associate Dean of Research for the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Buffalo, she negotiated that they change the name to Associate Dean of Research and Inclusive Excellence. You can see her focus in equity, too, in the way she mentors students of all backgrounds and in the way she has worked to bring together equity-oriented food systems planning scholars to collaborate and learn from one another. These are just some of the reasons that I have long been inspired by Dr. Raja and why I want to be like her when I grow up. Please give her a warm Michigan welcome.
Good evening. I think it's 6:30. It's very close to my bedtime. But I have eaten a lot of sugar, so hopefully I'll keep you entertained. Let me begin by simply saying thank you. Thank you, first of all, to the people who organized this event and this class, not just for inviting me, but I was reading up on the syllabus and looking at who spoke here and what the intent of the class is, and I'm just grateful that universities and communities are working together and doing this work. So kudos to whoever thought of this. This is fantastic. And of course, thank you to Annika for keeping everything organized and all the faculty, colleagues, and community partners that are behind this initiative. I like to start with this picture partly to embarrass my colleagues and former students, one of whom is in the crowd, but also to point out that none of the information that we generate in the university is the enterprise of a single person. We really benefit from work that our students and colleagues do, the lessons our teachers taught us, and lots of community partners. So I always begin with a picture of, in this case, my fabulous colleagues and students at the University at Buffalo Food Systems Planning and Healthy Communities Lab, one of whom defected to the University at Michigan, but it's okay. It's not every day that I also have the pleasure of being in a room and sharing with colleagues that include both my teachers as well as students. So in the room is also present Professor Kami Pothakuchi, who was my professor when I was a graduate student. So we all want to be like her when we grow up. I'm really delighted to be here. The work that I'm presenting today kind of scales up and down from a neighborhood to the country overall. So you will hear me talk about the United States as a whole, but then we'll do a deep dive into my favorite city, soon to be your favorite city of Buffalo, New York. It's a 4-part story, and I will try to keep it tight so that we get through all of them. And there are some questions in the presentation per the instructions of my colleagues here. The first part of the story is just setting context, and I'm pretty sure that this is warm-up. It's like jumping jacks in food systems world. We've all done them. But I'll go through it just so that you kind of get settled with my weird pronunciation. And then I will walk us through something about local government engagement in food system, and then the heart of the conversation, which is about Rustbelt Radicalism, is what we call it in Buffalo. And then conclude with some thoughts about the future. So that's the plan. I'm willing to change it depending on what happens. Okay, so context. In this room, pretty much everybody has seen or talked about some version of this supply chain model. But today, I'm going to focus on perhaps what is not often talked about behind the scene of this supply chain version of a food system, which is what is really the question of equity within a food system, what is embedded behind what we might ordinarily call a food system. And every time I wake up, I joke and say there's another inequity that I'm bothered by today. So today I'm just going to share 7 views, and some of these may seem very familiar. The first is, no surprise, the population that we have in the United States, we rely on a certain number of people to meet our food needs. We rely on a certain number of retailers and grocery stores to bring that food to us. And in between, we have food processors and manufacturers that kind of drive the food from one end of the food system to the other. But what we're talking about is a concentration of power, because if you switch your perspective for 2 seconds and think about who is actually generating sales revenue, the perspective changes quite a bit. So we have a system where, as you all probably know, we have winners and losers. So here's your warm-up question. On average, $1 that Americans spend on food, has this already been covered? Okay, well, you're going to get perfect points on this. How many cents are on farm and how many cents are off farm? So the question is, what proportion of $1 is on farm? Pick your answer. How long should I wait? Okay. Similar? Okay. Okay. So pretty right on, because that is what it looks like. So all of you are thinking about who is actually benefiting in the food system. But of course, people might say, we prefer to eat processed foods. We prefer to have our food turned into Cheetos or whatever else, chips. So I like to think about, well, is the landscape that we function in somewhat similar? On the left side is the current budget for USDA spending on consumer education, research, et cetera, on food. And on the right side is what 4 companies spent in 2010 on direct advertising on food. So this too is education. This too is education. So the point here is that we are not making choices in an even landscape of what kind of messaging we get. Our choices are swayed by what we see in our media, in other kinds of outlets. So we choose societally to focus on one value versus another. So clearly, I'm not an architect because I don't draw good carrots. If we were to derive the same amount of calories from a carrot versus a chocolate chip cookie, yes, that's a chocolate chip cookie, we would be paying 6 times as much. Generally speaking, we are all aware that it costs more to buy healthier food, and that's really what the pricing is based on data collected by a scholar who watches market prices, Andrew Janowski. So we don't have the fiscal systems, economic systems in place that would enable rational choices towards healthy eating. But the thing that has me puzzled and focused on the most, and I didn't plan to come here after Shirley Sherrod, but I am grateful that I am here after her, is something that I'm pretty sure that she talked about. It's about this idea that in the United States, and increasingly in the global South, we somehow need to teach people to eat better. We need to tell them what good food is good for them and how to go about doing it. And these people, those people, othering a group of people and saying that they don't know how to eat and we can fix that. That is a very ahistoric narrative, and it draws attention to people of color, especially African Americans, as simply being consumers who need to be told how to behave and how to eat. But when, in fact, we overlook that in the United States, the agricultural industry was really driven by, on the backs of exploited, uncompensated labor of black farmers and farm workers. So for your observation, consider this timeline, and some things will be hard to see on it, and that's by design. So this is a timeline of data of change in farm acres. I'm going to click one button, and you're going to see what happens to acreage by white farm owners, farmers. So you can see that things are not that great. We're actually not seeing a lot of increase in farm acreage. Barely visible. So we need to do a better job as a country, period. But here's what we've done over the same time period for farms owned by black farmers. So we've gone from changing the narrative of black farm ownership to focusing on healthy eating behaviors of large swaths of population, overlooking their role in actually production of food in this country. That ahistoric narrative at the national level permeates into our neighborhoods, into our cities, into our policies, which I'll come back to later. As a result, this, again, I would presume is not that surprising. The focus, the intention of policymakers especially, and planners, I'm one of them, if we are not reflective, we tend to think on there's plenty of abundance, nothing's really wrong, and we focus on individual choices, failings, heroic behavior to cook well and eat well, etc., and de-emphasize the structural changes in the country that drive everything else. So what happens? As a result, no change happens here, but of course, no change is going to happen among people who eat either. In short, if we don't pay attention to the structures, including the invisible ones, we're not going to really see much change among issues of food access or eating behaviors, etc. And then the final is a slightly odd issue. And some of you who have seen the slide may not actually respond. And there's no clicker question here. So there's something on the table. I will ask people to just maybe shout out what they think is on the table.
Oxhorn or shofar.
Sorry?
It looks like either an oxhorn or a shofar.
Okay, right. Close, okay. What's your name? Okay. So the problem, I would say, in addition to the ahistoric narratives, is we focus on a very tiny piece that is our perspective, our own life's perspective that shapes our entry into food system work. I would argue even food system academic work, maybe even food system practice work, and certainly policy work. I cannot tell you how many times I hear city planners tell me, well, are you sure that it's really about policy? I know so-and-so who eats really badly. The tusk. Okay. So that's the context that I think about, and I suspect all of you think about. So we're going to do a little digression into now policy. The food systems work, I'm pretty sure what I've shared thus far is not unusual for any of you, but perhaps gets you primed to think about what is in my head. But now I'm going to talk about, so given all of this, what are local governments doing? What are planners doing? What are policymakers doing? Let me preface it by saying that by policy, what I mean is a decision to act or not to act. Both are policy decisions. So if you choose to not protect land, if you choose not to promote food entrepreneurship, that is also a policy decision. So a policy decision doesn't show up just in the form of a zoning code or a plan. It's also the absence of those things that count. So this work that you will hear about is drawing, first of all, on a survey of planners from across the United States. Planners being people who are generally held responsible for organizing how places work, preparing city plans, transportation routes, etc. They do a lot of stuff. So American Planning Association is a partner on this project, and with their support, we sent out a survey to planners across the United States to ask them a series of questions that all of you think about quite a lot, which is why you're here. So I'm going to share with you what they think. These are members of the American Planning Association who work on behalf of local government. It could mean city government, town government, village government, metropolitan government, all of them. And they responded to the survey, and about 3,000 of them responded, which shocked me, but that's good. That's where they were all from, and there's a second quiz question coming up. I will point out that where there's a lot of food production, not a lot of planners responding, but we'll come back to that. So the question is, what proportion of respondents who represent these governments indicated what you all think they should be indicating, that food systems is their top priority? 1%, 10%, or 25%? Wow, who primed you? That's right. So, majority of them, we're not involved, minimally involved. Some did say, yeah, they're doing something. This 7% odd group said they're significantly involved, and then there were the 1% that said it's a top priority. There's those of them. We also asked them, well, what prevents you from engaging in thinking about food systems? Because they may not actually think that they are doing something tied to food systems, but if you ask Jerry whether planners are impacting her farm, she's probably going to say yes. So whether they know it or not, their decisions actually impact food systems. So we asked them about what hinders you from engaging in food systems work. So I'm going to show you the results. There's a bunch of bar graphs, but I'll point the most important piece shortly. So all of the stuff on the left side are hindrances. Everything that is orange is a primary major hindrance. I'd like to draw your attention to the very top. Notice what is not a hindrance, whether communities want this or not. If you flip it around, it means communities are actually demanding and maybe leading action in food systems work, so that's not the hindrance. What planners are reporting is limited awareness of food system work, so there seems to be a gap. So they say we don't know much. I count myself in the same category too. But then those who actually do something, what is it that they do vis-a-vis food systems? So the next slide is about what local governments across the United States are actually doing. So obviously, the responses are going to be fewer, and I'm only going to show you the section of results that focuses on food production. So not retail, not any of the other stuff, because there's just too much information. So focusing just on food production, I just picked several planning or policy strategies, and you're going to see what is a favorite. So on the left side are not uncommon tools that are available to local governments. Local governments zone. They decide whether you can have this here or that here, casino here, school there, or not. So it legislates what you can have on a piece of land. They also sponsor programs. They put money into programming. They can buy land and put it into protection. They can reduce the cost of electricity, water, energy, etc. It happens for all sorts of reasons. They provide economic development incentives, grants, tax waivers, etc. I already mentioned the reduced price utilities. Planners and local governments also provide what are called density bonuses. That means if I want to build a house with 5 stories, I wouldn't want to do that, but they would allow me to build 6 on the same piece of land, and if I decided to rent that property out, I would get more in revenues. So local governments can do that. They have that tool. And then local governments also demand licenses. It's part of routine behavior, right? To operate a food business, you need a license. Everybody who has a food business here needs a license. So they have all of these tools, and we ask them, well, what do you do? If they use that tool, they said yes. And if they didn't use that tool, they said no. So what I'm going to draw your attention to are these 2 things. When it comes to telling communities what to do and what not to do, we're pretty active planners. But when it comes to actually incentivizing food system work, we're not. In other words, planners and local governments are leading with regulation, not with investment, not with incentivizing, not with thinking about food as a public infrastructure, but thinking about how do we just keep things in control. This, I would argue, is a problem for our future, collective future. So to sum that part of the story up, a little bit dismal. Not a lot of them view it as a priority, local governments. Those that do, they tend to lead with regulation. Generally speaking, very limited awareness. And then community interest and support is not the thing that's holding our fellow planners back. In fact, conversely, communities are leading the way. So that's the national bleak picture for your entertainment. So let's go to something more interesting. So because of this, a bunch of colleagues who comprise the Growing Food Connections initiative thought, well, what if we figure out who is already innovating? We call these communities of innovation that are actually using policy for the right thing. And then we identify where there's greatest opportunity for change, and we somehow link them together over time and see if we can actually make change. I'll tell you what happened. But let me tell you that there are some municipalities and local governments that are doing interesting things. They are shown on the map here. Not surprisingly, some on the East Coast, some on the West Coast, and some in the heartland as well. So that is starting to happen. For example, the city of Seattle has a very comprehensive local government response to food system work. Burlington, Vermont actually has publicly owned land that serves as a farm incubator. City of Baltimore is in the process of thinking of developing something called food equity councils. So there's a lot of stuff happening around the country. So we wondered if all of this is happening, where is actually the greatest opportunity for change? I'm going to skip this. We'll come back to this if you're interested. So there are about 3,000 counties in the United States. And there are about 40,000 local governments in the United States. 3,000 counties, 40,000 local governments. If you wanted to make change, perhaps those 40,000 governments, if they were slightly receptive to community responses, we would see a wide network of change across the country. So we ranked all 3,000 counties based on a bunch of indicators. Can they actually grow food? Then, do they actually have food insecurity? And where is there a greatest disconnect between the presence of food and the presence of food insecurity? To be honest, I thought that this probably doesn't exist. I was naive. Turns out, we have, in the United States, done a remarkable job of concentrating hunger and food insecurity into very agriculturally productive areas. So it's not about really not having enough food, which we've heard about. It's about a mismatch between where there is agriculture and where there is need. So to show you where on the East Coast, we have this for the country, but because of time, I'm only showing you a slice. You can see that these are highly agriculturally productive counties, but also rank among the highest in terms of food insecurity, limited access to food. So those things coexist. So we looked at these counties as opportunities for change, but only if a community partner in those counties wanted to lead the charge. So working with Growing Food Connections team, we were able to recruit and receive invitations from 8 counties around the country, including Mrs. Sherrod's county, which is Doherty County, Georgia. So I have had the pleasure of working with her for a few years through this project. But the short version is these 8 counties, communities of opportunity, they're across the United States, and they are using policy to draw tighter connections between farmers and consumers who typically are not at the table in policy conversations. And you can see here where the counties are. Every county that is in an orange block is a county of opportunity, but all the other counties are communities of innovation. And my colleagues at American Farmland Trust worked to bridge and develop peer learning networks across the counties. So again, not enough time to dive into the detail, but we worked on capacity building, and then I'm going to quickly share in a summary, what my takeaways were from this 5 years of learning. One of which was, as I said, agricultural productivity, just doing a good job of food production in the United States is insufficient. It's necessary, but insufficient to achieve food equity. The second is, we seem to be producing food in the United States where there are incredible environmental constraints. One of our counties of opportunity is one of the biggest chili producing counties in the country, actually in the world, but no water. California is another case in point. So we have this weird landscape across the country. But here's a thing that I did not expect, and I found the most telling was pretty much all planning and policy efforts that we examined. Very few of them were targeting structural transformation. Many of them were talking about increasing perhaps access to food, thinking about locating a grocery store somewhere, etc., but no serious concern about why is it that people don't have living wages, why is it that they can't just go procure food for themselves, etc. And then the final one, and perhaps no surprise for planners in the room, is that policies, the absence of equitable policies and programs that were equitable were generally a result of an inequitable process. So if you were starting a planning process and you did not have farmers of color in the room, guess what? You did not think about whether or not farmers can get access to credit. So depending on who you bring into the planning and policy process determines the kind of policy proposals you end up with. So, bleak story ended. Growing food connections is ongoing in some places. Some counties are doing better than others. And I will say, if Mrs. Sherrod didn't already say this, in all the communities of opportunity, in the counties of opportunity, the work of transformation is really being led by community organizations. So Mrs. Sherrod probably mentioned this, that her farm that was lost because of the Pigford case that she discussed was a precedent to the establishment of the idea of land trusts in the United States. Not only are these community organizations revamping food systems, but they're actually testing alternatives. So when those alternatives fail, policymakers are very quick to jump and point to them as failures, but very few realize the change they actually bring in our thinking and how new tools develop because of that initial experimentation that happens in the corners that we don't actually see. I asked planning students in my department if they knew where the history of land trusts came from, and very few could point to the New Communities Land Trust that Mrs. Sherrod and others established in Georgia. So, happy story, truly happy story. I'm going to take you now to the city of Buffalo, which, as I suspect most of you know, its history is not, it shares a lot of history with Detroit and other Rust Belt cities. And it has experienced some challenges, and it is experiencing some renaissance. But what comes in the future is going to be determined by what happens now and whether our decisions for the future are tied to the history of the city of Buffalo. So you're going to hear a little bit of that. So just so you remember where we are, how many of you in the room have never been to Buffalo, New York? Raise your hands. We're going to change that. Field trip. Professor Phooey? Okay. So city of Buffalo has many different stories that I could tell you. I'm going to focus specifically on this western portion of the city because I've had the privilege of working in the same neighborhood for about 13, 14 years, and some of you probably read the article that was tied to that neighborhood. So what I want to clarify is that I'm only focusing on this neighborhood because that's the story that I'm using to talk about other issues. But there are many, many stories that could be told in Buffalo, so please keep that in mind. So the question, since many of you haven't been to Buffalo, it had to be a Buffalo question. Which of the following was not invented in Buffalo, New York? And since you all are food people, ball jar, canning, grain elevators. If you don't know what that is, they are these contraptions that lifted grain from boats in the Great Lakes, put them on barges in Erie Canal, and shipped them out of eastern seaboard. Implantable pacemakers for the biology students here, and chicken nuggets. Which of them was not created in Buffalo? Seems like some people know about Cornell's history. So the purple, oh, sorry, I'm going to go back and show you a picture. That was created in Buffalo. Those are ball jars. That's a picture from my kitchen. My partner decides to buy them randomly at garage sales. There's lots of them in Buffalo. grain elevators, that's what they look like. For architecture students, you should know that these inspired Corbusier in his work on modern architecture. And this is the gentleman who invented the implantable pacemaker, also in Buffalo, Professor Great Batch. He was an electrical engineer, if any are in the room. And not the chicken nugget. And I put chicken nugget there really for Professor Phooey, because chicken nugget was invented at her alma mater, at Cornell University. So that's their claim to fame. But she's going to fix it. Okay. Okay. So now you know a little bit about Buffalo's history. Buffalo is also a city that is incredibly diverse. Historically, it's where a lot of Irish immigrants moved in. When African Americans were moving north, quite a few of them settled in Buffalo. Buffalo is on the Underground Railroad. Lot of history. And most recently, Buffalo is also a refugee resettlement city. So one of your fellow colleagues, Alex Judelson, worked on the refugee community in the city of Buffalo. All that to say that it's a city of many different kinds of people, but not everybody in the city has the same experience. So it's a city where people carry different burdens, and as the chart on the right side illustrates, the children who are in poverty in the city, a disproportionate number of them are children of color. That's a challenge. That remains a challenge. For food folks, a common way to think about this is often in terms of spatial disparities, Buffalo is not unique. This happens in Chicago. I think it happens in Detroit. It happens in other parts of the country, in urban areas, that you see spatial disparities in the prevalence of supermarkets and grocery stores. I'm going to show you what the prevalence looks by neighborhoods when you switch to predominantly black neighborhoods. So the prevalence of supermarkets changes. But what is important to understand on this slide is a little bit of finance and economics. On these two slides, I'm not comparing poor black neighborhoods and wealthy white neighborhoods. This data is the result of a regression analysis that controlled for wealth of neighborhoods. In other words, if you went into a wealthy black neighborhood and you went into a wealthy white neighborhood, these differences would persist. So one of a common mistakes that I think people, when they're not thinking about questions of equity, is they think it's simply a matter of something is absent or present. It's way deeper than that when you adjust for market factors. This is also adjusted for population density. It's not that there aren't people who wouldn't buy food. Now let's change that to stores. Again, you've heard about convenience stores not carrying very good food. When you look at their prevalence in predominantly black neighborhood, again, I'm not talking about poor black neighborhoods and wealthy white neighborhoods. The prevalence changes, and convenience stores are not the purveyors of the best quality food. What is also not on these two images is the ownership of these stores. So Buffalo was home to a store that was run by many black entrepreneurs, and many of those businesses no longer exist. Black entrepreneurship and ownership over the wealth in the city has declined over the years, but has left us with considerable models. There was considerable redlining by banks in the city of Buffalo. under service by city government historically. So we are in a situation that not only are we seeing spatial disparities, it masks disparities in control over wealth. So to change some of that, we are now, you're looking at pictures of the west side of Buffalo, the little dot that I had showed on the map earlier. A group of residents decided that they were done with their children not having opportunities for jobs, for recreation, for having to deal with violence on the streets and drug exchanges happening. So a group of residents organized and took over what were vacant lots and started what is now called the Massachusetts Avenue Project. So these pictures are actually quite old because I've been following them for a while. But I'll tell you a few stories about them. So they farm, they have a youth, they used to have a youth-run business. They have a mobile market, and they do all of this on the west side of Buffalo, keeping in mind that they started this work when all of it was generally under the radar of city government. What you see in the background, this building no longer stands there. Instead, today they have a fully functioning community resource center and a farmhouse that they have built, and it was just inaugurated this year. They used to produce fish on the site, but they demolished that because they are in the process of building the new farmhouse. And then the youth entrepreneurship, where they trained kids in actually running a youth cooperative, work that was led by a woman named Zoe Holloman, who now works in the city of Minneapolis. Because of the products that the kids actually produce, they were able to land them in one of our biggest grocery store retailers called Wegmans. Wegmans is a big deal in the Northeast, those of you who know Wegmans. And the teenagers were cutthroat marketers. If you were standing next to them at a farmer's market, good luck to you. But here's the important piece of the story, that MAP and the youth and staff and board community partners discovered that they were always running an uphill battle against policy. So in 2011, they joined hands with a broad coalition in the city to organize and change our zoning code in a way that was more receptive to the work that MAP did and the youth did. And I love this picture because there's a personal anecdote there. I was told by the kids that if they were going to be involved in this training, they would take control of the visuals, none of my PowerPoint business. So they designed these flyers, and the kids actually ran neighborhood training on zoning. How many of you think zoning is exciting? Good, a couple of you. Well, they convinced Buffalonians that zoning is exciting. They did what we would call in academic settings policy organizing, policy literacy work. So I would say you can't actually do food literacy unless somebody is doing policy literacy for you. And in Buffalo, we have MAP to thank for. Side anecdote, Adriana, who was a teenager at the time, is now a professional social worker. She graduated, got her master's degree in social work, and landed a job last year. And Jordan works for, I believe, the state correctionals facility. The city of Buffalo had a very dismal on-time high school graduation rate, but kids at MAP had a close to 99% on-time graduation rate. So all of that story, if we summarize it in a timeline, I have told the story from MAP's point of view. I want to tell you what the policy side is. On the top is everything that MAP did in partnership with a bunch of other people. So MAP incorporated somewhere around here in the late 90s. Residents actually organized way earlier. They established a farm stand in 2004. They launched the aquaponics project, then a mobile market, and then I ran out of space, but they just established a farm stand in the heart of the city of Buffalo, farmhouse in the heart of city of Buffalo. So notice all of this happening. If we go back into history this way, like that way on the wall, in the 60s, the Black Students Union at the University at Buffalo ran a free breakfast program for kids in the city of Buffalo. In the 60s, there were moves to establish Black food cooperatives, Black-run food cooperatives in the city of Buffalo. All this to say that there's a long history and legacy of work happening way back. And then notice the response of the city of Buffalo to food issues. Do I have my glasses on? Oh, I do. Okay, just check. So in 2006, the city adopted a comprehensive plan, their new plan. For those of you non-planners, plans are general guidance for how cities should develop and what they should spend money on and what they should do. The comprehensive plan of the city of Buffalo is what we would call food blind. Had no reference to food, definitely no reference to food justice or food equity or questions around food sovereignty, none of that. It was illegal to raise chickens in the city of Buffalo, and those of you who might have read the paper that I'm referencing, you will remember that MAP actually would violate city law quietly. I would show up and there would be stuff happening. Can you sell stuff here? We don't know. And then a woman on the west side decided to raise chickens when it was illegal to raise chickens. That led to organizing and ultimately to what we call the chicken ordinance in Buffalo. All this to say that stuff would happen here, then the city would respond. But fortunately, in 2013, we were successful. The Community Coalition was successful in establishing a food policy council by law. So unlike other food policy councils in many places, ours is not subject to the whims of the mayor or the county legislature. It is nested under the Board of Health and cannot be disbanded. And the exciting news from last year is that it is now quite a diverse council that actually looks like the city of Buffalo. So, what's coming forward? Looking back at history is important too, but I think sometimes in food work in cities, we forget who is actually pushing work forward. So this is Rebecca Williams, and I have her permission to share her picture. And I think she is, again, representative of many things that I have talked about, which is why her picture is up there. What she does is she organizes food folks into coalitions. She figures out who needs to talk to who and does a lot of the kind of work that Black women have done historically that is generally not being seen. So I chose to put her picture up here because she is responsible for training our youth in the city of Buffalo to serve on the Food Policy Council. We have 2 seats for youth by law. But youth cannot just go sit on a council. Somebody has to support them, and she does that work. She also organized, recently we now have a coalition of people of color working in the food system, and she's the lead organizer for that. So because of that, our way forward looks slightly different. We have a Black-led farm in the city of Buffalo, maybe more than one. We have a Black-led food retail cooperative called the African Heritage Food Cooperative that specifically is trying to change wealth around the city of Buffalo. And we have, I mentioned already, a diverse food policy council. But here's the interesting part. The city of Buffalo has decided that it's going to invest public dollars into something called the Northland Corridor, which is in one of our poorest neighborhoods of the city. And a signature piece of that will be food-related workforce development and a project called Project Rainfall that is focused on healthy food access and led by the communities of color in the city. So things are changing. So in my head, Buffalo's story tells me a few things. Some things ordinary, like raising a chicken when it's against the law, actually has value. By the way, our law now allows a certain number of chickens and no roosters. And last time I went to MAP, when they had chickens, they were definitely more than 4. And I said, what is going on? And they said, we don't know how to interpret the ordinance. So soon, so those practices of pushing the ordinance and then causing that conversation actually forces city government to think differently. It's not possible to do that without community coalitions. MAP is a very small not-for-profit, and I would say that Buffalo has benefited from very diverse coalitions. Not all of them were food-related. Some of them were environmental coalitions. We have an very active economic justice organization that is part of that coalition. And then there is a fortunate willingness among community organizations to focus both on when can we get the chickens going, 2, can we organize for zoning code transformation, which is so not exciting to most people, but they're willing to do it. And then if organizations just do it for themselves, but they don't build capacity broadly among residents, then that change doesn't get sustained. And I think what happened in Buffalo was a lot of the organizing was not for just the advocates, but more broadly for residents. But for me, what I am noticing is that the communities that were not part of some of the conversations around policy were not part of those conversations because they were frustrated because their history was not recognized. So many of you probably already know this, that the Black Panther Party actually ran a breakfast program that many would argue set the stage for what is now our federal school breakfast program. So not recognizing that history and contribution of organizations historically, even if they failed in doing what they were doing, and then expecting them to sit in and step into policy processes today and then bemoaning when they don't show up to meetings is problematic, because it truncates history and doesn't really get us to where we need to go. So I am ending on time. Between the national landscape and Buffalo's story, I do feel hopeful, but I also have some caution. And this is more a note to self as a planning professor about all the things I do wrong. Earlier, when I was talking about the country at large, I said planning generally is food blind. But a colleague of mine who I have great respect for, and I have the privilege of working with her on Growing Food Connections, she and I were talking one day. Her name, by the way, is Jill Clark, and she's at Ohio State University. Jill and I were saying, once people figure out that food is important, they develop these food blinders, that they stop seeing anything else. So if you have households where family members are incarcerated and they're making daily trips to visit their family members, if you ask them if food is important, they're probably going to say no. So while food is important, we also have to continually think about how food questions are related to broader social questions, mass incarceration being one big one in the country. The second one, reiteration, that if planning discipline, local governments are going to really truly play a role that history will look at us kindly, then we can't just focus on regulation. We have to think about governance. We have to think about infrastructure investments. And then this one, I suspect, is no surprise for this group that is very interdisciplinary, that none of us really from our own disciplines, planning included, can truly understand a complex problem alone. We have to work across, otherwise we end up with weird diagnoses. So I'm sure you all have talked about the problem with the term food desert. So MAP, where MAP is located, they're doing a fantastic job. They have a mobile market, et cetera. If you look up USDA's directories for food deserts, that's what they'll call it. but it's not. So please, ditch the term. I hope by now you will agree that history is important to where we are today, but if we don't teach about it, if we don't actively learn about it, then we're bound to actually continue to be ahistoric. So we have to figure out not just how to teach it for the faculty in the room, but for community partners, students, etc. It's never too really early to figure out what the history of a place is and people. And then this has come to me more and more lately, is that food system is really a lever rather than a space for transformation. So I am with you, I'm with the food folks. We need better functioning food systems for the sake of food, for anti-hunger, food security, better health, all of that. But its power as a lever for broader transformation is something that we have to figure out way more. And I'll make a pitch for the planners in the room. I'm a civil engineer by training too, so I figured out how to, design bridges. In fact, I forgot to mention this. I don't know how. My hometown, I was born in Kashmir. Kashmir is a reference to a fabric, but believe me, it's a place and people called Kashmiris. Why am I telling this? Oh, so because trained as a civil engineer, I worked in Kashmir, and my job was to design buildings and bridges, which stuff didn't make sense because the place was getting bombed in a civil conflict. So engineering didn't make sense to me because of its depth. I value that training. But something wasn't right about the overall system, which is actually what led me to planning, and then to Kami Patakuchi, Jerry Kaufman, Jack Huddleston at UW-Madison. Planning can do its job right by simply playing the glue function. Planners don't need to know how to, well, I suppose they should know how to farm, we all should, but they don't necessarily need to know exactly why a particular crop does the way it does, but they do need to understand how to connect the dots across the food system. But of course, we can't play that glue function if there aren't the right voices in the profession. Planning as a profession nationally continues to be dominated primarily by people who actually have no understanding of many of the communities where they work. So I will leave it with some guidance from a colleague of mine in Buffalo. This is actually also with his permission. This is the back of Alex Wright, who's the founder of the African Heritage Food Co-op. And his slogan is, anything less than ownership is unacceptable. And so my Rustbelt Radicalism revisited is that while I continue to think that incremental radicalism is important, but if it doesn't happen rapidly with restorative food justice, we're not going to truly make progress. So now I'm ready to take your questions.
So I work in a community that has a lot of issues. And what I see is there is land, and the planners and the government are willing to let people use that land to grow crops, to do things. But they don't give them ownership. And the idea is, we'll let this, oh, aren't you special, grow this food. And then when some industry or some other player that will give us tax revenue comes back, we'll take the land back and we'll put that plant or that company or that whatever there. And so the community doesn't really own the land. And I think I see this in other places around. And people put a lot of energy into building the gardens, into building the farm, into building the thing, but there's always this risk that it's going to be snatched out and back up, under them. Is that happening in Buffalo too?
Great question, and I agree with your observation. That happened to Buffalo quite a bit, and probably like Detroit, Buffalo did not have a very strong development pressure, at least when I arrived there. I arrived there in 2001. So the idea, I remember two people talking to each other. I was pretty new. One person said, gentrification may happen. The other person laughed loudly, like I thought they were going to fall over. And I watched both of them because it was the case that there was no evidence of gentrification, but we were also watching other parts of the country. So community gardens in the city of Buffalo were sold with no notice. After they were well managed, they looked really nice. Adjacent property owners put a bid and they were gone. And part of it was that we had a very tenuous lease arrangement with the city. We have a fantastic organization called Grassroots Gardens of Western New York that holds a master lease on behalf of community gardeners with the city on public land. I don't know if that is the case either in Detroit or your community or here. So that happened, and because of that, people like Rebecca, whose picture I put up, and others in the city did a lot of organizing for land access, and we have just established, I think, the city's first land trust. And people are recognizing that land access is important, and people are just buying it or putting it into trust. But I think that if you are talking about Detroit, the magnitude of challenge in Detroit is way bigger. Kami could speak to this. Buffalonians are watching it and trying to organize and get land access. We've definitely seen it, which is why I think policy literacy and policy organizing and talking about land access is so important. I agree with you. There's also a National Land Trust Alliance that is working with cities across the country to help establish land trusts for farming. Is that happening here?
It is happening
okay.
in Detroit.
Great.
The discussion, at least. We don't have a model exactly identified yet, but the discussion is happening. It's rigorous, and the concern is being able to put these properties in a land trust where that they will remain a part of the community, for the 99 years or whatever the case may be.
So this is not directly related to your question, but I do want to air this out. It's actually one of the slides that I skipped. I think for folks who are committed to food work, it's worth it to some degree to either ourselves or work with a colleague or identify an ally who understands public finance really well. It could be an attorney, it could be somebody else, somebody in the university, because I think that there are some perceptions in city government across the country, and I won't say this is the case in Buffalo, but generally, city governments have a way of identifying what is the highest and best use of land, which is what you are referring to. But the calculations of what is the highest and best use of land, the methods that they actually use to determine that, are methodologically flawed. So they tend to be, to give you one very short, quick example, when cities compute whether this casino versus a farm is a good or bad use of land, they will look at tax revenue, and that's what we will all talk about publicly. But both pieces of land also have expenditures associated with them. Traffic, crime, noise, air pollution, etc. So there is very little public discussion about the expenditures tied to land use. And I think food folks have to figure out how to draw attention to all the ways in which food-related land uses, they may not generate enough in property tax, but they provide all other ancillary, indirect revenues that are not being captured right now. It's the guy who knew that it was a tusk.
My name is Arham. I'm a biopsychology, cognition, neuroscience major. As regular citizens and the general public, how do you suggest getting more active and holding government officials and people in power more accountable for not caring about food systems? And how do you suggest bringing that to their attention?
Well, A, you're neither regular nor ordinary citizen. You're a neuroscience major. So I would say, Arhan, is that Arhan? I would say you should do some neuroscience research about how policymakers make decisions and then confront them about how they make decisions. Like, ask them, what went into your mind? I'm only partially joking. I honestly think that specifically about, I don't know what your area of neuroscience is, but I think we need to understand why people make the decisions and air it out publicly. So that aside, as a regular citizen, as you said, I would say show up at your Common Council meetings and voice your support for different things. In every community, I would say, well, the first step is figure out who's already doing excellent work in your communities. By excellent, I mean figure out who the Rebeccas in your community are, and then lend them your support. I'm just using Becca as an example. She drives people to meetings. She drives youth between places. She makes phone calls. She's organizing phone trees. She's taking notes, passing emails. It's an extraordinary amount of organizing work. So if you don't want to do anything, do organizing. But neuroscience is pretty cool, too. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hi. I was wondering if in your research about the food policies in the U.S., if you also looking for if these kind of policies are effective, because I think if you have a lot of policies but they are not working well, it's don't work, you know. Like if you consider that in your research, you say you have a lot of zoning policies, and a few of the other kind of stuff that if they are effective.
It's a great question. So if you, just looking back at the timeline, at least in the case of City of Buffalo, it's very difficult to identify changes in outcomes. So if you are interested in, has food insecurity dropped, or has consumption of fruit and vegetables gone up, it's very difficult to measure in that time horizon. And I would say that that's probably where the next piece of work needs to happen. It's not happening yet because it's too early. So in my observation, from idea to policy adoption is about 10 to 12 years. Certainly the case in Buffalo, but that's what we're learning across the country. So right now, what at least my team is doing is simply aggregating policies. Leslie mentioned a searchable database. So right now, we're simply gathering what communities are doing. And then maybe 5 years, maybe 3 years down the road, somebody else or us, it doesn't have to be us, can look at what the impacts of those are. I know that in the city of Buffalo, we did an assessment, not of outcomes, but of conditions, like where is there access to food or not, in 2008. We're just getting ready to think about a 10-year follow-up to see whether the landscape has changed, but we're not there yet. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think that's the challenge. New York City has just published work done by Nevin Cohen and some other colleagues on policy indicators. You may want to look at that, but they too are not necessarily looking at outcomes yet. It's a great dissertation question for somebody.
questions on the left side of the room.
Hi, this isn't actually a question, but I'm Anika. I'm the program coordinator for this course, and if you're interested in this work, I forgot what your name was. I don't remember. Said you can join the Washington County Food Policy Council, specifically the Planning and Zoning Policy Action Team. So come join this work. It's happening. Not a question, though. Sorry.
There's a question in that.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. For someone that's not in food systems, it was very informative. Thinking about the bigger picture, as the food movement is growing, is there a long-term goal for the food movement, like sustainable farming within cities? And then the second part of that, what is the role of non-urban areas?
Great. So the first one is a little bit hard to answer because there are many food movements and they vary from place to place. I would say the way food work is unfolding in the US South, Georgia, etc., is very different than how it is unfolding in the Northeast or the Northwest. And I'm actually afraid that the national understanding of food policy work is very much filtered through Northeastern eyes. And that's a problem. So there isn't necessarily a good answer to your very difficult first question. But in terms of policy, just city governments are trying to coalesce and figure out what the future looks like and what they need to do. And these are not necessarily US city governments. So there is a very strong move in many of our European counterparts. Milan, Italy, for example, shepherded something called the Milan Pact, which was a pact that was signed by mayors in many cities across the world. And they choose, it's voluntarily, they're signing on to taking some food policy action. And the number of cities is growing. So if you're interested in a more global perspective, Milan Food Policy Pact is an example. In the global south, still sticking with your first question, there is a significant push in the three countries that I know the best, which is India, Jamaica, and Ghana, to really focus on an intersection of environmental justice and food justice. So the conversation is not about why aren't people eating well. The conversation is very much about we're losing our farmland to flood, hurricane, etc. I would say that the emphasis there among city governments, those are tuned in, but also community partners, is very much about thinking about what are ways to develop food systems that are sensitive to climate change. That is not, I don't see that as much here. Part two, I forgot the question. Oh, rural. That's a really important question for the US because there is a presumption, I think, that this work is not happening in rural communities. But in fact, this work has been happening in rural communities way back, from the 60s, 50s, even further. From a policy point of view, in many rural communities, there isn't a person named planner or a policy zoning person. But somebody is actually exercising the activity that goes with planning and plan implementation. And in my observation, many of those people are in public health. So folks here that are in public health would know this better than I would, that in a lot of rural communities, a lot of work in rebuilding food systems and making sure they work for people that live there is coming very much from public health. It's also very, I am overusing the word ordinary, but I'm going to use Cass County, Iowa as an example. Anybody from Cass County, Iowa here? Nobody. Wow. So Cass County, Iowa is heartbed of big ag. And even though they have big ag, a lot of farmers weren't doing well. So in a little area in Cass County, a bunch of people, community residents, decided that they wanted to figure out how to circulate money within their own economy. So they developed, literally themselves, printed out little coupons and said, if you go to my farmer, you'll get a $5 coupon back. Then you go to the shoemaker, then you get another discount, et cetera, et cetera. So they kind of forced a conversation and exchange of transactions within their community. And when I said, well, that's fantastic, they said, I know him, he goes to my church, I meet him at the post office, etc. There's a very ordinary way of doing policy that most people wouldn't call policy, but I would. They're essentially taking action publicly to rejig their food systems by very ordinary measures. So it's happening. Doherty County, in our communities of opportunity, 4 of the 8 were rural counties. One of my favorite was Cabarrus County, North Carolina, that decided that it was going to deviate its property tax revenue into something called the Food System Fund. It's pretty remarkable. So there are examples of that happening in the US.
Hi, my name is Sonia. I have a question regarding what the role of county and city governance is and how they work together to make this all happen.
And Samina, if you could keep it a little short, I want to have one last question in the back.
Okay. So city governments discharge different functions and county governments discharge different functions. And it depends on which part of the country you're in. So in our, just zooming into Buffalo, New York, the city of Buffalo is responsible for a lot of activities within the city boundary itself. But the city of Buffalo, as an example, does not have a Department of Public Health. The county government has a Department of Public Health. So our Food Policy Council is managed by, it's through an act of both city government and county government that work together to make sure that the council works. So I would say very different. City governments typically exercise a lot more activity around police, around zoning, around land use within city perimeter. But again, the challenge is it varies from place to place in the country.
Hello, my name is Ian Tran, and I was wondering if you could speak to any parallels to, you mentioned with Community Land Trust that there's sort of a national network. For food sovereignty or food security, food systems work that works across scales, whether it's hyperlocal, municipal, or internationally, do you know of any efforts that are looking particularly effective or useful or underway at this time that you are working with or part of?
Okay. Honestly, I am not very familiar with National Movements and Land Trust Alliance and what they are doing. Organizing around land access?
Sure, land access or just food security in general.
Nationally.
It doesn't have to be national. Just, is there any? Do you have any examples of I guess movements or initiatives that are doing a good job in cohering some of the different efforts underway at local as well as regional or national or international levels?
So I'm going to give an example of what I know best, which is I'll bring you back to Buffalo. So come visit Buffalo. So Grassroots Gardens of Western New York, historically, like I said, played a bridge between our gardeners and city government. So they never had land for themselves. Neither did city residents. So Grassroots Gardens cut a deal with city government to craft a master lease on which they put public land and then they facilitate gardeners' access to it. So that was a okay model, but Grassroots, like the earlier conversation, felt that to have food sovereignty, you really needed a better model. So Grassroots Gardens of Western New York is right now in the process of reestablishing itself as a land trust in the city of Buffalo. So I would invite you to look at them as an example of doing that, because they have more than a 15-year history of not being a land trust, but providing access to land and then choosing to go in this direction. And then I have one example which is not a land trust, and Kami knows its history better than I do. In Madison, Wisconsin, there's a 40-acre site that residents organized, and it was a pretty long process. She's written about it. But it is now called Community Groundworks, right, Kami? And they are a really interesting land trust model because they have both a housing land trust and a working urban farm on the 40-acre site. So you could look at that.
I'll just also put a plug in for our Food Literacy for All speaker next week, Dara Cooper. She is an organizer with the National Food and Justice Alliance.
Oh, yeah.
So she's a perfect example of somebody who's organizing at the national level who you might be interested in.
Why don't we thank Samina again for visiting with us and for a great talk.